Hello, it's Thursday the 31st of March and you're watching Scotland at 7 with me, Hugh Stewart. I'm in a Glasgow studio and tonight we're joined by Linda Fabiani, who's joining us from South Lanarkshire. Hello Linda, how are you tonight?
All grand, thank you, Hugh.
Right,
Sunshine
it's good to
and
see you again.
snow.
Thanks for joining us. Now Linda, I'm going to first of all go through the latest updates from Ukraine on day 36 of the Russians' attack on that country. First of all, we hear the Russian Defence Ministry has announced a local ceasefire today to allow civilians to be evacuated from Ukraine's besieged port city of Mariupol, according to Agence France Presse. A humanitarian corridor from Mariupol to Zaporizhia via the Russian-controlled port of Berdyansk would be opened from 10 a.m. Local time at 7 a.m. GMT today, the minister said on Wednesday. Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky has warned that Russia is massing its forces for a big offensive in the eastern region of Donbass. He said Ukraine was prepared for it and added that any Russian withdrawal of troops from around Kyiv had been forced by the fierce resistance of Ukrainian troops. Russia and Ukraine will resume online peace talks on Friday, the 1st of April, that's tomorrow. President Zelensky says he talked to Joe Biden for an hour on another very active diplomatic day, thanking the US president for a new $1 billion humanitarian aid package and for the additional $500 million in direct budget support. President Zelensky said, "The support of the United States is vital for us, and now it's especially important to lend a hand to Ukraine to show all the power of the democratic world." UK, US and EU officials say Putin has been misled over Russian military performance. Putin has received misinformation about how well Russia is doing and how much the sanctions have affected his country because some of those closest to him are afraid to tell him the truth, according to a speech planned by the head of Britain's GCHQ spy service on Thursday. Sir Jeremy Fleming has also said that some Russian soldiers are refusing to carry out orders and that they are poorly equipped and have low morale. Global restrictions on exports of industrial components to Russia have hit car and tank production. A car maker has shut down and tank production has been halted, according to the US. The UK has announced new laws targeting the access of Russian oligarchs to UK aviation and maritime technical services, according to the Foreign Office. 8 Russian oligarchs on the UK's sanctions list over their links to Vladimir Putin were granted golden visas to live in Britain. The individuals were granted the right to live in the UK after promising to invest at least £2 million under a controversial Tier 1 investor visa scheme the UK government has admitted. Russian hackers have recently attempted to penetrate the networks of NATO and the militaries of some Eastern European countries, according to a report by Google's Threat Analysis Group. The report did not say which militaries had been targeted in what Google described as credential phishing campaigns launched by a Russian-based group called Coldriver or Callisto. Slovakia says it will expel 35 Russian diplomats based on information provided by intelligence services. Fellow EU countries Belgium, Netherlands, Ireland and the Czech Republic have all announced the expulsion of Russian diplomats suspected of spying. And finally, on a roundup, the families of 21 seriously ill Ukrainian children who were airlifted to the UK amid much government fanfare fear they may never see them again due to delays in visa processing. The children were flown to the UK and some have cancer and some are receiving end-of-life care. Now, Linda will return to that story and after the next news from Ukraine. So as we said earlier on, Russia is building up its forces in eastern Ukraine in readiness for a new wave of attacks in the breakaway Donbass region. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky has said, as another attempt was being made to rescue civilians and to deliver aid to the besieged city of Mariupol. In an early morning video address, the Ukraine's president said that Russia's drawdown announcement had been forced upon the Kremlin by the fierce resistance of Ukraine's armed forces. He added that his government was instead seeing a build-up of Russian forces for new strikes on the Donbass and preparing for that. The region encompasses the two self-proclaimed People's Republics, which Russia says it is helping to free from Ukrainian control. Yesterday, the leader of the self-proclaimed Donetsk People's Republic, Denis Pushilin, said that offensive operations were intensifying. Donetsk includes the besieged port city of Mariupol, which has seen some of the war's heaviest fighting and bombardment, and where about 170,000 people are trapped with scarce food and water. This morning, Ukraine's Deputy Prime Minister Irina Vereshchuk said that a convoy of 45 buses was on its way to the city after the International Committee of the Red Cross confirmed Moscow had agreed to open the corridor from 10 a.m. local time. That's 7 a.m. GMT. The corridor was to be open for 3 hours today. Previous attempts to organise safe passage has failed. Moscow denies targeting Ukrainian civilians in its 5-week bombardment of the city. A successful evacuation would build on Russian promises to draw down its forces in some areas before the planned resumption of peace talks on Friday. Ukraine's government and its Western allies remain wary that Russia is building up its forces in eastern Ukraine in readiness for a new wave of attacks in the breakaway Donbass region. Despite the withdrawal claims, Russian forces have continued to bombard the northern city of Chernihiv and parts of the capital, Kyiv. A renewed move on Donbass would be consistent with Moscow's claims this week about a withdrawal from some areas to focus on what they call liberating the breakaway eastern region. The fate of Donbass, which Russia demands Ukraine give up, was a topic of discussion at peace talks held on Tuesday in Istanbul. Last night, a senior Ukrainian negotiator announced that the talks would resume online on Friday, that's tomorrow. President Zelensky said the talks had produced nothing concrete, while one of his senior aides said the Ukrainian leader could meet Putin soon. Ukraine has sought a ceasefire without compromising on territory or sovereignty, although it has proposed adopting a neutral status in exchange for security guarantees. Russia opposes Ukraine joining NATO, the Western military alliance, and uses potential NATO membership as one of the reasons for invading. Now, Linda Fabiani, I'm going to move on shortly to a story on refugees into the UK, so let's leave that for just now. On this question of talks, can you see any way out here? Because President Zelensky seems to be conceding quite a lot. He's conceding now that, OK, we will promise not to join NATO. Do you think that's is a ground here for negotiation and for an eventual Russian withdrawal?
Oh, it's so difficult to say. You know, I've read so many commentaries from people who know far more about these things than I do, and indeed most of us do. Um, I wondered when I heard that there was this concentration on Donetsk, Donbass, etc., whether that was, you know, doing that today because the peace talks are resuming tomorrow, and then part of the potential negotiation, as well as the neutrality, as well as the guarantee of not joining NATO, would be to cede some of that territory. Perhaps this is on the agenda. As for President Zelensky, you know, what decisions that man has to take. You know, what must be in his mind is stopping the atrocities that are going on, stopping the deaths of all these people. So, you know, it may well be that he's willing to make certain compromises, you know, for the greater good. And of course, someone in his position should be thinking that as well. You know, I'm interested at the other side too, you know, looking for guarantees from President Putin, you know. I find that a bit worrying because I'm not convinced that guarantees would in fact be honoured in the short, medium or long term. So it's a heck of a position to be in, but the humanitarian aspect of it must always be in the forefront of the minds of those who are having these negotiations.
Yes, guarantees. I was speaking recently to somebody from Belarus who now has right to remain in the UK, and he was talking about the previous guarantee, and he was reminding me that Ukraine already agreed to give up its nuclear weapons many years ago. at the end of the breakup of the Soviet Union, and they did that on a guarantee that the Soviet Union would not attack. So I'm quite sure everyone in Ukraine is quite well aware of what happened to the
Yeah,
last guarantee. Right.
yeah.
Well, let's move on to the question about the UK visas. Now, first of all, in the House of Commons today, the Shadow Home Secretary, Yvette Cooper, has said that refugees in Ukraine are facing what she called a Kafkaesque bureaucracy as they try to navigate the Home Office visa requirements. Ms Cooper had tabled an urgent question over the government's two visa schemes, with MPs from both sides of the House rounding on the government. The Shadow Home Secretary cited cases, including those of a woman who had travelled extensively to fulfil the requirements, including to Warsaw to give biometric data, and a mother and son who had been granted a visa but then had it revoked. Yvette Cooper said, "This is Kafkaesque. What on earth is going on? Why is the Home Secretary so totally incapable of getting a grip on this?" Ms Cooper asked, and she continued, "Why on earth is it taking so long? Why are they still demanding reams of bureaucracy, reams of information? Tens of thousands of people are still stuck in the system. Families are desperate. People across the country have said they want to help, and yet the Home Office is letting them down." The Home Office Minister, Kevin Foster, answering MPs' questions, said that the trajectory of visas being granted every day is increasing. He said there had been 23,500 visas granted to Ukrainians with family connections in the UK and 3,705 under the Homes for Ukraine scheme, but said it was too early to say how many of those had actually arrived. A string of Conservative MPs, including former Ministers Stephen Hammond and Robert Jenrick, expressed concern at the slow pace of visa processing for a Homes for Ukraine scheme. The SNP's Stewart C. MacDonald, MP for Cumbernauld, called the bureaucratic hurdles faced by applicants in Ukraine clunky, bureaucratic and frankly traumatising. The Scottish Government announced today that people who open up their homes under a Homes for Ukraine scheme will not be subject to an increase in council tax following changes to the law. The single-person occupancy discount will be protected for people offering space to those arriving from Ukraine into Scotland, whether it's in a domestic home or a self-contained accommodation. Amendments have been made to the Scottish Council Tax Discounts Regulations of 1992 to ensure that the discount is protected. These changes will also ensure that the Homes for Ukraine £350 thank you payment will not affect the level of council tax reduction a household can receive. The status and income of Ukrainian residents living with families in Scotland under the scheme will also not be considered when calculating any council tax reduction. So that's good news there. But let's go back to the story of the UK government saying we've given thousands of visas, but they can't actually say if any of those visas have actually resulted in the families coming here. What's your view on that then, Linda?
Well, I mean, Yvette Cooper's quite right. Our own Stuart MacDonald's quite right. Indeed, Tory backbenchers are quite right. The whole thing's just an absolute blooming mess. But there's a very fundamental thing there, and it's back to what Nicola Sturgeon said. You know, the UK, uniquely is demanding all these visas. As Nicola said, get the people here and then we'll sort out the paperwork. These are people fleeing a war, you know, and it's just absolutely ridiculous. It's part of the hostile environment that has been created by UK governments within the UK for people who are fleeing. It's absolutely appalling, and the the hoops that people have to go through to get the visa and then to be told they can't get it. I mean, I was, friends of a friend who are Ukrainian have been filling in the forums to get their families here. And it's 40 pages for each person, uh, you know, and then they send it in and then they're told it's accepted, but they have, you're right, Hugh, absolutely no idea of when their family is actually going to get here. So the whole thing is just a mess. Um, it has no humanitarian basis at all. And I, I'm just amazed at the amount of pressure that's been put on the Home Office by people right across the board does not appear to be making any difference at all. They just seem to be shutting their ears and shutting their eyes to it and carrying on with a level of bureaucracy that is just ridiculous.
We will be looking again at
I,
the Home Office in the next story, but let's just go back to the last
yeah,
point which we listed
yeah.
in the roundup today of those 21 children who the UK admitted. Now, there was a lot of fuss in the media. They talk these days about the media optics. How does a thing look? So it looks good to say these 21 sick children will not be allowed in. Sorry, will be allowed in, but now their parents are not being allowed in. So it's to do with optics, isn't it? You can see people arriving, but you can't see people not arriving. So
Yeah, I mean, when I saw the first thing, I only saw the report, as you said, the optics, Hugh, about, these 21 children being brought here for treatment. And yes, that's great, and that's wonderful. But the idea that we have children in palliative care and refusing to allow their parents to come and be at their bedside is absolutely appalling. And I would like to know who's making that kind of decision. Who thinks that that is acceptable? If ever there was a case for getting people here and dealing with the paperwork later, this is it. These bairns need those that love them round about them. And there's
well,
nothing.
of course, the Scottish Government simply has to wait for the Home Office to get its act together because that's, of course, a reserved matter to London. Next story is also on Home Office because a report today says that the Home Office has failed to transform its culture or to become a more compassionate department, as it promised to do after the Windrush scandal, according to a critical inspection report released today. Expressions of disappointment appear 14 times in this progress report, published by the independent expert Wendy Williams, who was appointed to advise the Home Office on how to reform to avoid any future crisis. Reviewing the department's progress in its commitments to address the problems caused by the Windrush scandal, Wendy Williams said that while officials had been ambitious in some areas, she was disappointed by the lack of tangible progress or the drive to achieve the cultural changes required. Acknowledging that some positive steps had been made, she said that the department was at a tipping point, and unless improvements were made, it was only a matter of time before it would face another crisis. Williams was appointed in 2018 to investigate the causes of the Windrush scandal, under which the UK government erroneously classified thousands of legal residents as illegal immigrants. In a 2020 report, it contained 30 recommendations for Home Office improvements, and the Home Secretary, Priti Patel, later committed to implementing all of them to build what she called a fairer and more compassionate department, committed herself to a total transformation of our culture, meaning the Home Office culture. But only 8 of those 30 recommendations had been fully implemented, Williams said, adding that the department had yet to implement the spirit of her recommendations, as she criticised officials for exaggerating the progress they had made. She was also critical of the department's failure to review the effectiveness of the hostile environment policies, now known as compliant environment policies, which is what caused many of the Windrush problems. Okay, we talked about, sorry about laughing there, we were talking about optics. So the hostile environment has gone and it's now been replaced by a compliant environment, I'm glad to report. Can you cast any light on the possible culture problems in the Home Office, Linda? Have you any idea where it came from?
The leadership. I think it's quite obvious. I mean, we're a few years down the line from what was an absolutely disgusting scandal. And, alongside the fact that nothing appears of any substance to have changed in the way that the Home Office work, there are still people who were affected by that scandal who have not yet had any redress and who have not had their cases sorted. It's dragging on and it's dragging on. And the report talks about, it's a damning report, absolutely damning, but it talks about the spirit. And surely the spirit of any government should be to make sure that those who are in the country that they're supposed to be governing are properly dealt with and dealt with fairly. So if there's no spirit of that from the top, it's not going to wend its way down. I mean, I have heard, and it is all anecdotal, that there's a culture of fear in the Home Office. From junior level right through to senior level. So these people are not going to be working in the spirit of anything. They're going to be doing is trying to cover their backs all the time, and that's part of the problem. So yes, the problem starts at the top. And we still do have a hostile environment. I suspect there's a hostile environment in working in the Home Office as well. But there's certainly a hostile environment for people out there. Now, I personally felt at the Windrush scandal quite strange about it all. I was getting obsessed with it. And then it dawned on me that probably that was because my own grandfather was a migrant to Scotland. He was an economic migrant, quite unashamedly so. And, like many other Scots Italians, um, I was sitting there thinking, do you know, this could affect my family too. This could have affected the Scots Italian community. It could have affected the Scots Indian community, the Scots Pakistani community. And it's absolutely appalling that they haven't really taken the bull by the horns here and sorted it out and came up with a fairer system, better practices in the spirit of those who live in England, Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland. And if they're not capable of doing it, how about transferring some powers to the devolved administrations over immigration, asylum, so that we can have a decent humanitarian and fair system for those that live in our respective countries?
Yes, the Scottish Government would want that. Before COVID, of course, we did hear the Scottish Government saying frequently that, Scotland actually needs more people. So, in fact, we're saying, yeah, tell them, invite them to come here. we do need a workforce. We need talent. We'll be looking at the question of talent and entrepreneurship later on. How many talented entrepreneurs might be trying to get into the country? So again, that's something which needs to be devolved, but it's not going to be anytime soon. Let's move on, Linda. So what we heard today on the DWP, switching to another department from London, the SNP's member of the Scottish Parliament, Stewart, has today called for the Department of Work and Pensions, the DWP, to publish the data which they hold on the impact of benefit sanctions. In a debate in Holyrood earlier today, the SNP Member of Parliament invited MSPs to add their name to a letter to the Secretary of State for Work and Pensions, Theresa Coffey, urging her to publish the data on the impact which sanctions have had on people. The data had previously been requested by several Westminster committees since 2013, and the House of Lords has voiced its concerns that the refusal to disclose this information appears to be endangering people's health. Today's debate in the Scottish Parliament is centred on a recent paper from the University of Glasgow, which has reported significant associations between sanctions and increased material hardship and health problems, and found some evidence that sanctions were associated with increased child maltreatment and poorer child well-being. Commenting, Stewart, MSP, said, "There is no doubt that policies like cruel Tory benefit sanctions have been hurting some of the most vulnerable people in our communities since their introduction. It's crucial that we are able to understand the full impact it's having on families and children. The DWP must now publish the data they hold. The fact that it appears that they've been hiding it for so long is worrying in itself. It's especially vital during the spiralling Tory cost of living crisis, as these brutal sanctions exacerbate the hardship already facing households." Now, some of that looks kind of no-brainer. Taking poor people on benefits and then reducing their income is going to have detrimental effects. Obviously. What's behind this? Is it the Tory idea that poor people have to have the stick rather than the carrot? Is it all to do with forcing people to get into work? Is this the Tories' idea of how to force people out of poverty? Is that, you think, what lies behind that whole strategy?
Well, I've thought about that a lot, Hugh, since they introduced universal credit. Around about the same time, it was when Ian Duncan Smith introduced the bedroom tax, then with universal credit, which on the surface of it looks quite streamlined and okay, but in the practice of it has been absolutely appalling. Now, the reason they won't publish the figures is quite obvious. it's because the evidence is damning. It must be, or they would publish it. Do you know, if they had data that showed that there was no adverse impact on people by sanctioning them, they'd be publishing it weekly, trying to get kudos for it. So they know that it's damning. So why do they behave like this? They seem to have this almost a Victorian view of deserving poor, non-deserving poor. And it's absolutely appalling. As you say, they use the stick rather than the carrot. With no recognition that the vast majority of benefit claimants are just people that need a bit of a help that any caring society would give. And sanctions, oh my goodness. I mean, I've been out of Parliament nearly a year now, but I know that there will be MSPs all over the country and MPs all over the country who are still getting representations from people who are sanctioned for the most ridiculous of reasons. You know, some of the things that the Scottish Government have been able to mitigate, you know, very early on, we mitigated the effects of the bedroom tax. Social Security Scotland have, for example, said there will be no more regular humiliating examinations of people's health, of people who suffer long-term conditions and with the best will in the world are never going to be able to do certain kinds of jobs. But why do they do it? I'm afraid it's quite simple. They don't give a toss. They don't care. Because you have a Tory government sitting in Westminster that are looking after their own, and it's full of self-interest, and they really don't care what's happening to other people. That's quite plain by what's been said recently about the cost of living. It's quite clear when you look at what the UK government is doing to alleviate some of the costs of the energy rises compared to what other countries in Europe are doing. They just don't care. And they're quite happy to let charities and others pick up the pieces that they're shattering.
Of course, gradually more and more of social legislation is coming into the Scottish Parliament, and of course there's a big difference in culture there. To go back to that word again, the Scottish approach is all about respect, isn't it? And that seems to be the exact opposite of this UK approach. However, let's move on again, looking at the clock. I better move on, Linda. There's a major announcement today on environmental policy for oceans. And this announcement was made by the Scottish Government up in Montrose today, where Rural Affairs Secretary Mary Gudgeon announced Scotland's blue economy, the plan to promote sustainable development of Scotland's marine resources. 6 environmental outcomes will be developed up to the year 2045. These are, firstly, that Scotland's marine ecosystems should be healthy and functioning. 2, Scotland's blue economy, that is to say the sea economy, will be resilient to climate change. Thirdly, marine businesses, both old and new, will be innovative, entrepreneurial, productive and internationally competitive. 4, Scotland to be a global leader in healthy, quality, sustainably harvested and farmed blue foods, which means food from the sea, right? And 5, communities have more equal access to the benefits of ocean resources. And 6thly, Scotland will be an ocean literate and aware nation. We'll discuss what that means in a minute. So Mary Gudgeon said, Scotland's seas and coasts support vital jobs across our economy, especially in coastal and island communities, providing many goods and services, as well as contributing to our overall well-being, she said. In conclusion, there's a potential for an ambitious and inclusive blue recovery for people and nature, and for the blue economy vision the blue economy vision will start us on that journey. And for information about Scotland's blue economy, Scotland has 617,000 square kilometres of sea area, and that's 7 times greater than our land area, and also something like 18,743 kilometres of coastline. The marine economy supports nearly 75,000 jobs, and the sector generated £5 billion in gross value added in the year 2019. And in case you haven't heard of the blue economy, which you hadn't until earlier on today, Linda, the blue economy concept came into focus during the 2012 United Nations Convention on Sustainable Development. The Scottish Government's vision suggests a move away from what used to be regarded as a trade-off between economic growth on the one hand and a healthy environment on the other, towards a policy of stewardship where the ocean and other resources are counted as natural capital, which human societies ultimately depend upon. So, Linda, there's quite a large report which I looked through today, about 38 pages or something. Now, this is, although it's just 38 pages, but there's really a huge amount in there. We're looking at those 6 pretty massive objectives over from now till 2045. So this is probably the most ambitious document I've ever looked at. Right. So what do you make of all that? I don't know if down South Lanarkshire, if you're any better informed of the marine environment than I.
Well, we don't have any coastline, I have to say. I mean, I had no idea what the blue economy was when I first saw the headline, I have to say. So thank you for the information that it came from the 2012 summit. And you've taught me something as well, Hugh. Blue food. There you go. Who knew that was fish? So, what do I think about it? Well, yes, it's hugely worthy. Of course it is. And, it's something that we do have to take cognizance of. I was having a wry smile to myself there when you said that we have 617,000 square kilometres of marine area. And I wondered if that was before or after Tony Blair stole some of our ocean from us when he moved the boundary line. That was way back, I think it was 98 or something. The sea line for Scotland used to be from the border of Scotland straight out, and Tony Blair's government moved it up a wee bit and put it at an angle, so we lost quite a lot of our square kilometres that way. So fascinating to look that we've got 18,743 kilometres of coastline. It's a phenomenal amount. Scotland's never been short of water, wind, rain, etc. So looking at the action points, I think they can be divided. Yes, it'd be good to have more public awareness and indeed community access, and indeed, teaching about our marine environment and the importance of it in environmental terms. I would say that's already started. I mean, our school children are quite well aware of the environmental impact of treating our oceans badly. So I think we have to build that more so as people really are more aware. Climate mitigation, of course, that's all part of that as well. But the reason I'm saying divide it is the absolute economic impact, the productivity, the innovation of the marine sectors. And of course, we shouldn't forget our fishermen that are in that as well. That's a huge part of our economy too. So it's getting that balance right, and to use the terminology, some of this new terminology we all have these days, the just transition from what has been the normal way of doing things to a better way of doing things, and making sure that we take all aspects into account of those that are currently part of that economy. And yes, we should be capitalising on that wind, on that water, on that wave power that we have. And that's where the new production comes in the marine sectors. That's where the innovation comes in. And all the more important when we're having that just transition away from oil and fossil fuels generally. So yes, it's extremely worthy. I haven't studied the whole document yet. I've looked at bits of it. I will look at the rest of it. What I'm interested to see is how we measure progress, and how we break down the different elements of this plan to ensure that we're being fair to all involved.
Yeah, so if anyone's interested, that document is linked off the Scottish Government website. And to answer your question on the sea area, yeah, notoriously Tony Blair took a bit of the Scottish sea area out and gave it to Northumberland. Looking at the map of those square kilometres, it looks like it's a whole thing that's included. I think I had a quick look at the map, and I think they've kind of reverted to the pre-Tony Blair borders. One thing about the coastline, you can't actually say exactly how much coastline it is because there's different ways of measuring it. So apparently that's not a straightforward question. But whatever, there's definitely something like 2/3 or 60% at least of the UK coastline is actually Scottish coastline. That's mainly because we're very jaggy and because we've got islands. So the marine environment and marine resource is a huge issue. And as you said, yeah, we have to work on these. I think this is an initial document expressing where the Scottish Government wants to go, but I think the sense of the document is that they will work through all of those proposals in more detail really over the years. So it's not so much a blueprint, it's more of a kind of aspirational document. But it's very interesting anyway, and it does point out that the member's phrase, the natural capital, the document stressing the fact that nature is in fact a resource, and if we look after nature, it will continue to look after us. So that's one of the fundamental ideas there.
75,000 jobs, Hugh, I noticed. And it was one of the things I noticed in the document. Currently, we're sustaining 75,000 jobs within the marine environment. That's a lot. It's a lot of employment.
Yes, it's a big sector. It's a massive sector, really. OK, let's move on now. The next story, we are looking forward to the council elections in Scotland, which are the 5th of May. And today, the Scottish Green Party are asking voters to think global, act local. The Green Party today launched the campaign for May's council elections in Linlithgow. This is the first election where the Greens are standing as a party of government. Speaking afterwards, co-leader Patrick Harvie said, "Concern about the climate crisis and the need for a just transition has never been higher, and the local elections in May can play an important part in Scotland's response. That's because the well-being of our citizens is at the heart of a green recovery, and that recovery starts in our communities. That's why these elections are so vitally important. We have Greens in the national government delivering free bus travel for young people, record investment in active travel, nature recovery and recycling, the biggest teacher recruitment drive since 2007, and so much more." Mr Harvie went on to say, "We now need more Greens elected to councils to carry this work on in our communities. But that will only happen if voters think global, act local, and give the Scottish Greens their first preference vote." So first of all, let's just remind people that we have an STV vote for the Scottish Council elections, and sometimes commentators, particularly from London, miss that out. So in your ballot paper, you will vote 1, 2, 3, 4 for different candidates. You don't just say, it's not just one vote like a Westminster election. But the other thing I wanted to raise with you is it's really the first time, as you're an MSP for the Scottish National Party, it's the first time your party will, of course, be standing against the Greens locally, but at the same time standing with them in Parliament. It's an odd position to be in, isn't it?
No, not at all. I think it's a very healthy position. There you have two parties that are committed to independence for Scotland, but who have variations in how they think policy should go forward. And local government's very important. I'm quite fascinated by the think global, act local, because I think I must be getting really old, because I remember that as a Lib Dem campaign slogan some years ago for local elections. Yeah, I have a memory of that. Think global, act local, because the Lib Dems always had the philosophy that it was what you did locally that then affected globally. So they must have dropped it some time ago, and the Greens have picked it up. So yeah, and it makes sense. It's a very sensible way to be achieving things. But no, I have no problem at all with if you're in coalition. Sorry, it's not a coalition, is it? I can't remember what the technical term for it is in the Scottish government. But no, I think it's absolutely healthy when you're going locally in fairly small areas to be up against each other, and that bouncing off all the ideas and policy initiatives can be healthy.
Yep, that's one of the ideas, of course, of having also proportional representation in the Holyrood Parliament, of course, is we're not supposed to have domination for year after year by one party, as you get in other parliaments. Anyway, by the way, we will be commenting, of course, extensively on the council elections as we move closer to them. We'll be covering that thoroughly on Broadcasting Scotland. Now let's move on now back to London. The SNP's Environment, Food and Rural Affairs spokesperson Deirdre Brock, Member of Parliament, led a debate on food security following growing concerns that the war in Ukraine will have a huge impact on global food imports. The Edinburgh North Leith MP warned that shortages of animal feed and fuel cost increases as the result of the war will have an impact on the cost and supply of domestic food produce, and called on the UK government to empower domestic agriculture and abandon the laissez-faire and Brexit trade deal policy. It's estimated that amidst the fighting between the two countries who make up a significant portion of global crop production, food prices for UK consumers could jump by as much as 15%, highlighting the impact of Brexit-related supply chain issues and the UK's withdrawal from the EU, leaving British farmers without access to a proposed €1.5 million, that's €1.5 billion emergency fund to counter food insecurity. Deirdre Brock also called for the UK government to provide additional funding to the Scottish government and the other devolved nations so that they can act to support their own specific food security needs and interests. So obviously the food crisis is exacerbated by the war in Ukraine, where I read the other day farmers are having great difficulty planting the crops, planting the seeds. Very patchy in Ukraine. Some parts there's hardly any effect by the war. Other parts, of course, fields can literally be a minefield. I read that yesterday. So food prices are going to go up. But I suppose the one thing here that sticks out to me is Michael Gove saying a couple of years ago when we left the EU, all that EU funding will be replaced by Westminster funding. 1.5 billion euros, that's approximately 1.2 billion pounds. Right? As have you heard of Michael Gove coming up here with 1.2 billion pounds in his suitcase?
Well, you know, they did say that. They also said that things would be cheaper. It was going to be the land of milk and honey when the UK left the European Union. So much that has been disproved on that, of course, has been pretty much hidden because of the headlines being kept up first with the pandemic and now with the war in Ukraine. But there are still big issues that are entirely due to Brexit. And no, as far as I can make out, they have never come up with any tangible offers to replace the EU funding that was to support farmers and food supply, etc. So I didn't get to listen in to Deirdre Brock with her stuff today. But from what you've said, Hugh, it sounds to me everything she's saying is making perfect sense. And already food prices have been rising. And, you know, it's perfectly obvious that this will get worse. When you look at Ukraine and you talked about the difficulties of planting seeds, you know, that is one of the bread basket of Europe, the Ukraine. So there are going to be ongoing issues there. So all in all, it's like the perfect storm that makes things more and more difficult. So things are getting more and more expensive. We have a Chancellor and a UK government who are basing supposed mitigations of that on old inflation figures. So people are always trying to catch up. And then you add on fuel costs and everything else. There's big issues there. So there's issues at the production supply level. There's also issues at the retail level for people trying to feed their families. And the UK government really does have to get a grip of some of this. And instead of benefit sanctions, instead of cutting universal credit, instead of ridiculous loans to help combat fuel costs, they really should be taking the responsibility for looking after the population a bit more seriously. And again, fund devolved administrations to be able to alleviate some of the suffering that people are going to have.
Yes, of course. We had commented last week on the vast gaps in Rishi Sunak's mini budget last week. There was hardly any mention of the inflation pressures that you've talked about. On the economy, let's move on to the next story. Scottish Economy Secretary Kate Forbes today met with leading entrepreneurs and innovators in Glasgow to discuss working together to deliver the entrepreneurial ambitions of the National Strategy for Economic Transformation. And the first of a series of industry roundtable discussions, talks focused on the entrepreneurial actions in the strategy. These include embedding first-rate entrepreneurial learning across education and skills systems. Secondly, creating a world-class entrepreneurial infrastructure of institutions and programs. Next, providing a high-intensity pathway for high-growth companies. Attracting and retaining the very best entrepreneurial talent from at home and abroad, and finally building an entrepreneurial mindset into every sector of our economy. Now, I guess what is meant by entrepreneur measurement really is how many new business startups do you get every year. I'm a bit out of date, but a while ago I looked at this, and the number of business startups in Scotland is roughly similar to the Midlands of England or something like that, but in both places, well behind London. That's the place. London South East has more new businesses set up, almost twice as many. So that's really what we're talking about. Do you think the government, in any case, can any government actually make people become entrepreneurs?
Oh, that's a difficult question. Everything you said there, Hugh, I feel that we've been hearing for many years over and over again, with the exception of one bit that you said there that struck me, which is embedding a culture of entrepreneurism within education. And I think that's extremely important. But there's other elements of it that are important too. And that's about just the whole culture we have for entrepreneurship and businesses. And I'll give you an example. This may have changed. I don't know if it has or not. It may have changed since I left Parliament, but it's only been a year. We measure from schools what we call positive destinations. And that is those young people who go into further education, who go into higher education, or who go into work. And I was very, very shocked a couple of years back to discover that nobody tracked a positive destination for someone leaving school that started up their own business. And the reason that came to my mind was I had a young constituent who had created a very, very successful business. She had left school. She hadn't sat any hires. She didn't go to college or university. She started up her own business, which was award-winning and became very, very successful. And I found out that according to her school's records, she would not be in there as someone who had moved on to a positive destination, which is just ludicrous. She was actually employing people. So that's a very, very basic thing that says to me, we do not value enough people who at a young age start their own business or have business ideas. You then move on to the bigger elements where you have the likes of Scottish Enterprise and others who are there to promote business. And very often there are certain boxes that have to be ticked before people will even have a discussion with somebody that can perhaps help. So I'm quite pleased that the likes of Sir Tom Hunter and others have come in with Entrepreneurial Spark to try and help some of that stuff. But I think what we're up against is a culture that doesn't really value people trying. And if you add into that the difference between Scotland and perhaps the US, where people in the US can fail at 6 businesses and then be successful with a 7th, and they're not thought of badly. Whereas in our culture, if you fail, you're almost deemed as a failure. So I think there's quite a lot of cultural aspects to it we have to get right, and perhaps embedding that kind of education within our education system will help to turn that round a bit.
Yes, it's interesting you should focus on a young woman who had started a business. We were looking at another report today which said that investors are less inclined to put money into female-led businesses. So, well, half of the population, if our young females feel additional burdens or additional barriers, maybe what we need to do to create that kind of culture is to look at what those barriers are and see if they can be removed. So that's maybe something that the government can do, not say, just get rid of barriers rather than saying to people, go and start a business, but saying to people, like, what's causing problems, what's preventing you? Let's see if we can take those barriers away.
I know there are some MSPs in Holyrood who have been working on that for some time. Gillian Martin MSP comes to mind. And there was, and I presume it's still active, a very active cross-party group on looking at the barriers that women in business in particular face, because they are there. There's systemic barriers to women within our society and everything, and in business as well as anything else.
Yep, so we'll finish on the economy. Now, another report up today is the Scottish Vision for Trade report. Work is underway to remove barriers to global trade as part of the efforts to grow Scotland's international economic opportunities. The Vision of Trade annual report sets out steps taken to increase progress towards net zero through trade, while making it easier for businesses to access international markets. The report shows progress on meeting the aims of the recently published National Strategy for Economic Transformation, which seeks to strengthen Scotland's position in new markets and industries, while generating new, well-paid jobs out of the just transition to net zero. The report also looks at how trade is helping Scotland's economic recovery following the impacts of EU exit and COVID-19. Trade Minister Ivan McKee said the Vision for Trade sets out 5 principles which underpin our trade decisions and relationships. These are inclusive growth, well-being, sustainability, net zero and good governance. This annual report shows how we've been putting these into practice to meet the needs of Scotland's people and businesses. These principles, Ivan McKee said, has never been more important in view of Russia's illegal invasion of Ukraine, which rightly demanded severe economic sanctions. I welcome the steps taken by many Scottish businesses who have done the right thing and severed links with Russia, and I call upon others to follow where it is safe to do so. So what Ivan McKee seems to be saying here is that it's not about free trade. It's not about go wherever the price is lowest. It's trade plus various ethical considerations on top of it. So you could say we're talking about just trade, not just cheap trade. Is that how you look at it?
I guess, of course, Ivan McKee is a very, very successful entrepreneur in his own right before he became elected to Parliament, so he knows what he's talking about. And I mean, it has been a theme through all of the Scottish Government stuff over the last few years, that well-being and fairness, work practice and everything else all have to be part of things moving forward. So yes, that's welcomed.
Now, I'll just, so I think that's what we're talking about. I remember when I used to teach economics, the classical position was that if you can buy something cheap overseas, you do that instead of sourcing it at home. Because another one of the points that's made in this report, which I had a quick look today, is that trade always involves winners and losers. And so that means, basically, as we all know, businesses can close, whole industries can close, because China can do it cheaper, really. So
Well,
the document does say there'll be winners and losers. So in future, he's also saying in this report, whenever we encourage people to move into a particular trade, we have to ask, well, who's going to gain from it? Who's going to benefit? And how much are those benefits going to spread around the community? And on the other hand, balance it against who's going to lose out. So basically, what I'm saying is trade usually means somebody's going to lose a job. Is that right?
well, to use the phrase that the Greens have been using, think global, act local, makes sense in this as well. It's very difficult, Hugh, because it's all very well saying, it shouldn't always be the cheapest, it's the best. But try telling that to somebody that's just had their universal credit cut, you know. So it's one of these things that can't be looked at completely in its own. All these things have got to be looked at and around. So they should all fit into making society better, the well-being of society better, so that people can actively make these choices. I mean, many of us are very fortunate that we can make these choices in our day-to-day lives. Many of us do. But not everybody can do that. But that's a very different thing from the multi-million, billion-pound firms that choose deliberately to outsource because things are much cheaper. When you look at what P&O have done recently, that's a whole different ballgame. So all of these things have to be addressed and come into play to make it a better
So I think that's the sense of the report that Ivan McKee's produced today. It's all about ethical or social attitudes to the cost and benefits of trade and not just going for the cheapest option. So Linda, I'll just finish up one final point, which kind of goes back to what we said earlier on about the marine environment. The Scottish Government today has also been talking about natural assets or natural capital, a phrase we used earlier. Future private investment in Scotland's natural capital, such as peatland and woodlands, will be subject to a set of principles to help ensure it delivers social, environmental and economic benefits. During COP26, the Scottish Government committed to develop a values-led and high-integrity market for natural capital. That's one that restores and enhances nature, as well as supporting the just transition which involves and benefits communities. 6 interim principles have now been published, setting out the government's ambitions and expectations for responsible private investment for communities, investors, landowners, land managers, public bodies and other market stakeholders. The publication makes Scotland the first country in the UK to set out its ambitions for natural capital in this way. These interim proposals will help to inform and develop market rules, including options for enforcement mechanisms for the natural capital market, such as regulation. Under these new principles, investment should, first of all, support diverse and productive land ownership. Secondly, deliver integrated land use. Thirdly, deliver public, private and community benefit. Next, demonstrate engagement and collaboration. Fifthly, be ethical and values-led, and be of high environmental integrity. Now, I've noticed tonight we've got a lot of lists. There's not a list of 6 bullet points for you there. But we seem to be saying that, any investment which involves environmental use of woodland or peatland has to not only just make money for somebody in the short term, but it has to also protect the natural environment for the future. So I think it's back to this idea of counting the natural environment as part of your economy. Do you think there should be some way of measuring, how much damage we're creating in the environment and kind of putting that into the economic numbers?
Well, 6 seems to be the optimum number for bullet points tonight. I can see what's been said here, but the Scottish Government can't do this on their own. That's got to be devolved down the way to local authorities and local decision making within a set of guidelines. For example, we've got a wonderful peatland just up the road from where I live. Fantastic. So the local authority should be charged with making sure that that is preserved as it should be, and that any development around about it or partially on it, which may well happen, should be something that looks after our natural capital. So it's about everyone working together. And just very quickly, would I say, when we're talking about all this stuff, we should be talking about housing as well. And we should be talking about creating good neighbourhoods and creating housing with very low energy costs. We've talked about it for a long time. Lots of good ideas there. And we still keep putting up wee boxes with tweaks here and there to make them a bit more efficient. We can do so much better.
Yep, so that's finally on natural capital, preserving the actual natural services which keep us all going. And that's it for today on day 36 of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. So thank you to Linda Fabiani for joining us tonight to discuss these stories. So I'm just going to finally thank our subscribers and our supporters who are in fact keeping us going. So if you are one of our subscribers, thanks. And if you'd like to help keep Broadcasting Scotland pay our bills, because we've got, of course, the same electricity bills to pay as everyone else, have a look at the link below on the broadcastingscotland.scot, and it would be great if you could join in with the hundreds who already support us and keep us going. Even a wee standing order of £5 a month will make a big difference. We are looking to expand the range of programmes and to get more people in the team, but of course we can't do that without money. So if you agree with Broadcasting Scotland that the country needs an independent broadcaster, which is not based in London and not broadcasting mainly the London View, then you have to pay for it, in fact. So I hope you support us and agree that we do need to have independent broadcasting for Scotland. So that's it from me, Hugh Stewart, for tonight. So thank you to Linda Fabiani, and I'll be back with Scotland at 7 tomorrow. Thanks. Bye now.